Once again, Shabbat Shalom and Chag Sameach. In life, as in literature, crossing a body of water often heralds a moment of transformation. The Greeks whispered of the river Styx that formed the boundary between earth and the underworld, where the ghostly ferryman Charon would transport the souls of the dead on their voyage to the hereafter. In 49 BCE, Julius Caesar and his army crossed the Rubicon, which is a shallow river in the northeastern part of Italy that protected Rome from civil war. Caesar's crossing was considered an act of insurrection. There, he declared, alea iacta est, the die is cast. We remember George Washington crossing the frozen Delaware River the night after Christmas in 1776 in a surprise attack on Hessian forces in Trenton, New Jersey. The runaway slave Eliza crosses the frozen Ohio River at the heart of Uncle Tom's Cabin. In Harriet Beecher Stowe's own verse, so over the roaring, rushing flood from block to block she sprang, and ever her cry for God's good help above the waters rang. And God did hear that mother's cry, for never an ice block sank. While the cruel trader and his men stood wondering on the bank, a good man saw on the further side and gave her his helping hand. So poor Eliza with her boy stood safe upon the land. All of us Jewish Americans find a water crossing at the heart of our story, the story of our family, whether in persecuted flight across the Atlantic or as pioneers and entrepreneurs, the huddled and the hopeful. And of course, water crossings figure prominently in the Hebrew Bible. Noah's ark-bound journey from a world doomed to a world reborn, Jonah's aborted flight across the Mediterranean to escape the prophet's mission, Joshua's triumphal march across the Jordan carrying the Ark of the Covenant. The Bible even tells us that before he started making house calls at Passover, Elijah's final earthly act was to roll up his cloak and touch the waters of the Jordan River with it. The waters then divide to the right and the left, and Elijah crosses over the Jordan on dry land, together with his apprentice, Elisha. This last scene, of course, echoes or perhaps forecasts the greatest water crossing of them all in the Bible and indeed in all of literature, which is the Torah reading for this seventh day of Pesach, the crossing of the Red Sea. A moment of transformation. Entering the water as slaves, we emerge free men and women on the other shore. Of course, we had no choice, no retreat. With the Egyptian army in hot pursuit, the Israelites arrived at the water's edge, and then the Torah tells us the divine pillar of cloud and fire positioned itself behind the Israelite encampment, but still in front of the Egyptians, forming a barrier that prevented the enemy from moving forward and overtaking the Israelites. But this also presumably prevented the Israelites from moving backward. Here, a famous midrash, a famous rabbinic legend, inserts brave Nachshon ben Aminadav, the man who entered the sea without being asked. The waters, they said, reached his ankles. The sea would continue to rage. Nachshon went in up to his knees, his waist, his chest, the sea closing in over him, and only when the water reaches his nostrils does the Red Sea part and our people enter on dry land. Presumably, the rabbis who wrote this legend wanted to instill a lesson of faith in the face of an insuperable obstacle. But I say, Nachshon had no choice. With fire and cloud and an army behind him, and nothing but open sea ahead of him, where else could he turn? I'm reminded in an uncomfortable way of those terrible images that are seared into our minds of the World Trade Center jumpers on 9/11, those helpless victims with cloud and fire billowing behind them and nothing but the open blue in front of them. Life hands us experiences over which we have no choice. Time moves on in only one direction, and we must march forward, sometimes into a sea of uncertainty or grief or sadness or despair. And I do not know why this is so, but there are years in our life that can take more than they give. So over time, each of us becomes threaded into a common web of human experience, the kinship of loss, a universal society of every generation that must say farewell to the people we love, the generation that came before us. There is no going backward, only forward. And I have walked alongside many, maybe even you and your family, in that sea of grief and loss, and I always emerge with cause to marvel at the faith that we all have to keep moving forward, whether it is by choice or by consequence. And I do not know why this is so, but instead of drowning, I have always found that just the courage to walk forward causes the waters of grief and loss to part a little bit, so that by going forward, by going through, an encounter with loss becomes a bit easier to bear. Jewish tradition recognizes that loss and the effect it has on us, the trauma of grief, passes through many stages, and therefore one's reckoning with it must also take the form of a journey of stages. Even before a person enters Shiva, one is called onain, a state in which one remains from the time of death until the time of burial, when Shiva properly begins. Rabbi Maurice Lamb, whose masterful book, The Jewish Way in Death and Mourning, provides the definitive writing on this subject, observes, an onain is a person in deep distress, a person yanked out of normal life and abruptly catapulted into the midst of inexpressible and inexplicable grief. That person is disoriented, his attitudes disarranged, his emotions out of gear. The shock of death paralyzes his consciousness and blocks out all regular patterns of orderly thinking. The deceased lies before him, as the sages said, and psychologically that person relives the moment of death every instant of this period. The onain is like Nachshon before he entered the sea, this solitary figure trembling on the water's edge. But then a ritual begins. The family is gathered, a rabbi or a cantor or just someone who cares shows up, a funeral is arranged, the loved one's story is told, the act of kriya performed, where we tear a black ribbon or a piece of our clothing so that inward grief finds outward expression, finds its way from the heart to outside the breast, a badge of love and loss, of honor and hope. And sometimes when I walk with a bereaved family down the long aisle of the sanctuary of our temple, a sea of mourners and friends on either side, I think of those Israelites marching through the Red Sea, and I feel a little bit comforted. It happens again when, as we leave the grave, custom invites those gathered there to form two rows in order to allow the mourning family to pass between them and feel their shelter and support. How very much like the Israelites passing through the sea, I sometimes think. And what a necessary miracle of faith it is to place one foot in front of the other in that awful moment of leaving a loved one to rest. Oftentimes in the rituals of loss and bereavement, I share these words from the 23rd Psalm, which you will hear in tomorrow morning's Yizkor service. Even before the famous line, "The Lord is my shepherd," there's a little epigram that says, Mizmor LeDavid, a psalm of David. According to Jewish tradition, the psalm was written by King David. My friend Les Gutterman has observed that the fact that this of all poems is ascribed to a king is meaningful. Kings, he says, now as then, have many privileges and prerogatives. One they have never enjoyed, however, is exemption from sorrow. Death has a pass key into every home, including the royal palace. King David, it should be noted, buried his son Absalom, and therefore David is an authoritative writer when he says, "Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death," he is telling us that one must walk through the valley. We cannot run. Bereavement sometimes comes quickly. Healing is always a slow process. Shakespeare also said it well. What wound did ever heal, he asked, but by degrees. Like Nachshon entering the sea, David cannot escape the valley of the shadow. It has an entrance no one can avoid. The only way across the valley or the sea is through. And on the other side, we emerge transformed. We discover that love does not die, though people do, and that our loved ones may leave our world, but in so many ways they never leave us. For we have, in fact, been changed by them. And who we are, the way we think, the way we talk, the way we act, the way we move through the world even after our loved ones have died, is an act of integration, of memory, of these gifts, of the holiness and the love that our loved ones gave us while yet they lived. And that is why we mark this seventh day of Pesach, which is a joyful festival. We've been singing happy songs tonight, but we also mark it with a yizkor, with a service of memory, not only to remind ourselves of how our loved ones lived, but also to acknowledge and, yes, even celebrate how we have emerged on the other side transformed by their lives. When the Israelites came to the sea, the guiding presence of God's pillar of cloud and fire retreated from in front of them to behind them, leaving nothing but the sea in front of them. Rather than as an abandonment by God on high, it is possible to understand this maneuver as a tender demonstration of God's love. I think the Torah wants us to know that God had their backs, as it were. The only way across was through, and so they walked into the sea, a promised land yet before them, the presence of the divine behind them. So may our shepherd in the valley of the shadow transform all that we cherish that has become memory into sources of healing, lasting blessing, and the strength to move forward. And let us say, Amen.